really interested in is finding out, okay, what are the actual mechanisms that underlie the kind of changes we experience in meditation? Long-term transformative meditation, or meditative development, we sometimes say. From contemplative science, we know that long-term meditators actually seem to have less higher level activation. Even at rest, even not meditating, they have less higher level activation, typically associated with self-related processing. Activity being lower down means that we are kind of taking in more information from the world, and we're sort of in a way more responsive to it. We have a bit of a better fit with what's actually happening. And so there's a certain kind of agility that we can kind of see there.
You mentioned two different routes to deconstruction of the mind, the Jhana route and the insight route. So, computationally speaking, what's the difference between these two paths?
We've all heard the instruction to just let go. But what if that wasn't just a metaphor? What if letting go was a precise, quantifiable event happening in the computational architecture of your brain? Today, I'm speaking with Shawn Prest, a PhD researcher at the Monash Center for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies. Shawn is bridging the gap between ancient wisdom and modern technology by using computational modeling to understand exactly how meditation changes us. In this episode, we dive into the fascinating science of active inference, the theory that your brain is a prediction machine, constantly hallucinating your reality. Shawn explains how we can mathematically model mental tension, the neurological difference between the jhanas and insight paths, and how we can upgrade our internal models to reduce suffering and potentially reach new levels of peace and happiness. If you're interested in the actual mechanisms that underlie the changes we experience in meditation, rather than just the theory, you're going to love this conversation. I'm your host, Josh, and welcome to the FitMind Podcast.
Shawn Prest, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks, Josh.
You are currently a PhD student at the M3CS.
Yeah, the Monash Center for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies at Monash University. And yeah, I'm just finishing up my PhD there.
So you're currently studying the meditative effects on PAC, which is perception, action, and cognition.
Yeah, basically how meditation impacts perception, action, and cognition, and what are the mechanisms involved there.
How was it that you started to get into this kind of work? What has been your background in terms of meditative experience, practice, and also some of your education and research?
I was definitely a meditator before I was a meditation researcher. At a certain point, I started meditating, kind of for reasons that aren't particularly interesting. But I became increasingly fascinated with how experience changed when I did. And yeah, eventually I ended up going on retreats and more retreats and going quite deep and ending up in a lot of altered states. And I noticed how it was transforming my experience over time. And as this was happening, obviously it was really interesting. I was feeling a lot better. Felt like I was kind of shedding a lot of stuff that had sort of internally tripped me up in the past. And of course, I guess just because of the kind of person I am, or I'm quite like curious about stuff, it was kind of like, okay, but how is this happening? Why is this happening? Because to be honest, I didn't even, until I saw how meditation changed me, I didn't even believe that meditation could do the things that I was finding it was doing for me. And so, yeah, I increasingly wanted to understand like how it works, basically. And so I kind of started to steer my professional life towards researching that. I had previously done an undergrad in computer science, and then I did a master's in philosophy of science in Spain, and now I'm doing the PhD at Monash. And so, yeah, what I'm really interested in is finding out, okay, what are the actual kind of mechanisms that underlie the kind of changes we experience in meditation, and particularly long-term transformative meditation or meditative development, we sometimes say.
What was the foundations for you looking or moving into what you are researching in your PhD? Is there anyone you were particularly interested in, any work that you're building upon?
Yeah, there's been a bunch of, I mean, in some ways it's difficult to answer because I've been both interested in kind of meditation theory from a more practitioner standpoint, but academically in particular, I was interested obviously in a lot of the kind of work on contemplative science and kind of taking people into a lab and seeing how their brain changes and activation patterns during meditation and also changes over time. And one of the things that I found really interesting, I guess, is this kind of idea of the brain as a kind of prediction machine. And so a lot of the stuff I was very interested in early on meditation, academically, was kind of looking at trying to understand the brain using these kind of predictive theories such as predictive processing. And so, yeah, there's a bunch of different authors who have worked on that stuff over the years, people like Ruben Lakonen, Lars Sandved Smith, George Dean, Shamil Chandaria, and a bunch of others. And so, yeah, they were all people when I was doing my master's, for example, that I was reading a lot of their work. I was reading work on effective valence, kind of computational understandings of how our experience becomes more pleasant or more unpleasant, and all these kinds of things.
What is valence in this context, for anyone that doesn't know?
Yeah, valence is basically, it's just this sort of, I guess you could say, scientific or psychological like terminology for saying when experience feels better or worse. So if you'd prefer experience to be one way rather than another way, then you would say that the way you prefer it to be has positive valence comparatively. Mm-hmm. And this is perhaps a bit different than how we might talk about it in like meditation circles as well, because there's commonly this kind of understanding that, yeah, so you start maybe and your experience is somewhat negative, and then it becomes more positive, and then it becomes kind of more neutral, but in a way that you actually prefer over it being positive. So the kind of way I'm talking about it here is just, if you'd prefer it, it's more positive. So it's a bit different than that framing.
Would you say most people's goal would be then geared towards positive valence, particularly in shorter term meditators or somebody that might be new to the practice? And does that change over time from what you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a sense you could say that the whole Buddhist project is about reducing suffering, and that's just like the kind of inverted way of saying of improving valence. And so I don't think that all people start meditating actually for that reason. I don't think everyone starts meditating kind of focusing on trying to reduce suffering or reducing negative valence, things like this. I think some people are just more driven maybe out of curiosity, but yeah, that's definitely like a driving factor in why people meditate. And obviously when people talk about meditation and well-being, usually what they have in mind is something like that.
Why would you say that computational modeling is the best or a good approach? What was it that made you decide that it was a good approach to study the effects of meditation on the mind?
It's true that, like, and maybe I haven't actually said this yet, but yeah, I focus on these sort of like computational mechanistic understandings of how this works. And I think that, so basically, like if we look at kind of contemplative science, neuroscience of meditation, we have a lot of data on person does this, brain lights up like that. Now, the thing is, we actually want a bit of a better explanation of kind of how and why and how this unfolds over time, and kind of, what are the knobs and dials kind of in the brain that are being changed and tuned, which have this impact that's so valuable on our experience when we meditate. And so it's like we kind of want that explanation for how it works, rather than just knowing that, oh yeah, it works and it does change the brain in these ways, but it's sort of like how. So I think I've been interested in this kind of computational stuff because it sets out kind of principled ways they're grounded in statistical physics, actually, that look at basically how, if an organism is surviving, the kinds of ways it would need to be making decisions in order to continue surviving. And this forms like kind of a basis for understanding the kind of problem the brain needs to be solving in order to keep us alive. And so this is a kind of theoretical understanding of the kind of goals that the brain is trying to achieve. And then when you can combine this with the actual neuroscience and also the phenomenology, or kind of the experiential reports from people, then you can start to work out, okay, when this happening, there's sort of this computational process, and then because this is happening, then the brain lights up like this. So it provides a way of actually giving us some like explanatory power and interpretability of what's going on. And so that's why, if even we want to understand more, we kind of need to ask good questions about what's happening, and we need to test, we think that this is what's computationally happening when this person enters a jhana or something. And now we want to be able to actually then test something there and see if, oh yeah, this actually is the explanation for why this happens or isn't. And without kind of theory, we can't do that well. And so, the kind of computational mechanistic stuff is a way of developing in a solid, grounded way that kind of theory.
And for anyone that doesn't know what is a jhana, but I think we'll dive into that more later, so I can just keep it high level for now. And what is the leap between the theory and like what you would see in an fMRI? Is that like, is the model happening somewhere in the brain? Is that a good way of putting it?
It's a good question. I think different people think about this stuff in different ways, but I think that the way I like to think about it, and arguably the kind of most appropriate way to think about it, I think, is that models are a kind of description of reality. And so in this sense, what science is trying to do is it's trying to develop more and more accurate descriptions of reality. But these descriptions of reality are not actually reality itself. So, the experience of having a bad dream is not the same as the report of the bad dream that you give to your partner when you wake up in the morning or something. And so, so I guess when we're talking about, the models here, then it's like we're saying that this seems to describe what we're seeing and what we're observing that the brain is doing. But it's kind of like a step too far to say the brain actually is a model in a certain sense.
Okay, yeah, that's a great way to put it, actually. And the jhana, how would you briefly describe that?
Jhanas, which are found in Buddhism, but also in other contemplative traditions, they're basically what are sometimes called absorption states, and they're basically when you have quite a kind of more or less uniform experience is usually pleasurable, and it usually I can hear, I'm like, not sure I'm nearly doing justice to describing them, but typically people have to work to cultivate the ability to enter jhanas, and then when you can enter them, then they're helpful for developing concentration, and they're used to support people doing sort of more investigative insight practice. And they also just feel good. So they have a kind of restorative effect that people like about them. And traditionally, if you look in the suttas and there, then you would see things like the way one would become awakened would be to move through the jhanas, and then eventually have a cessation of consciousness, and then you'd have a degree of awakening. So they're kind of part of the, I guess you could say, the traditionally understood process of meditative development as well.
You use a framework called active inference. Could you start to walk us through what active inference is for anybody that doesn't know?
There's like different terms that people probably heard, and people might be more familiar with predictive processing as a term. And so for what I'm going to talk about, you can basically think of the active inference, or the active inference framework, is a kind of specific formalization of predictive processing. So you can think of them, for our purposes, as roughly synonymous. So predictive processing, it's a big subject. So it kind of, I think that kind of the kind of interesting place to start is actually from, again, this sort of thing of like, what is the problem that the brain is trying to solve? And so if you imagine the brain is sort of stuck in the skull, and you have a bunch of kind of senses, or you can think of them as sort of sensors, right? And they're detecting something that's beyond the senses, out there in the world. And somehow the brain has to figure out what that stuff means to the organism. And so it's not enough to just have a bunch of kind of patterns appearing on the senses. You have to kind of eventually decode those patterns into something useful that helps the organism survive. And of course, this involves a lot of things, but one of the things this involves is objects. We perceive a world that's full of objects, at least most of the time. And so somehow we need to turn all those patterns into objects, and then we also need to understand relationships between objects and what they mean and how relevant they are for our survival and all these kinds of things. Now, predictive processing kind of says that the way you can kind of solve this is by making predictions about what's out there, and then you kind of end up testing whether they're correct, and then you end up sort of revising them if they're not, or if they're a bit off.
Could you give an example of that, how that might happen?
Sure. Let's say that you hear a sound and it's at night and you think that it's a bear. Maybe not that common in Australia, but maybe a drop bear. And you think it's a bear, and so the first thing that pops into your mind, you hear the sound, is, oh, that's a bear, and maybe some fear enters you. Now, but then actually, you want to make sure, so you're going to be listening quite intently for, okay, the next time that I hear that sound, listen very closely. And then when you listen closer, you find out, actually, no, it kind of sounds more like, a slightly broken car engine or something. And so basically your understanding of what is out there in the world has just changed. It's changed from the best explanation for what I'm perceiving right now is a bear has changed into it's a car. And then, of course, all of the consequences of it being one thing or the other then follow from that.
Yes.
And so the way this is thought to work then is that we're always kind of trying to minimize our uncertainty about the world. And we're not just trying to do this in the short one, right, in the here and now, but in the long run. We want to minimize our uncertainty in the long run. And this is why this also can involve learning and sometimes having increased uncertainty in order to reduce uncertainty later. And there's kind of two ways that this is understood to work. There's perceptual inference and active inference. And so perceptual inference is basically you make a prediction and you update your model to conform with the sensory input you get. So in this way, you make your model conform with the world in a sense. And this is a sort of active part of it. Active inference instead is that you actually change the world to fit your predictions. And so you can think of something like, well, I predict that I'm warm enough, but then the sensory input coming in as you're feeling cold is that you're cold. So then actually you change the world, you put on something warm. So then the sensory input that's coming in is actually telling you that you're warm.
Like the majority of it would be subconscious. Is that right? It wouldn't be, at least the bigger part of the predictions or models that are happening would be subconscious.
I think there's generally not a total consensus on what aspects of kind of the brain's predictive models are conscious or not. It's generally thought of that they're sort of, I guess, kind of middle levels in the brain. So, very fast things are generally not considered to be conscious. There's a lot of sort of basic temperature setting, digestion, breathing prediction. There's a lot of stuff there that, you can be completely unconscious and all of that is happening. And the understanding is that involves also predictive models and this sort of process of like updating based on the feedback that we get back.
And that kind of leads us into you talking about the hierarchical generative model. So I think at the top we have, it's kind of a pyramid, right? And at the top we have self, or high-level thought or anxieties, worries, that kind of stuff. And then at the low level we would have like bare perception or feelings, the sensory data coming in. How does the data move between those levels?
There is just this understanding, and there's a fair amount of neuroscientific evidence on it, that the brain has what's often called a cortical hierarchy, where you have kind of increasing abstraction as you go up, and you also kind of have self-processing at the top there.
Yeah.
And the kind of idea is, particularly when we're talking about this in terms of predictive processing and active inference, is that the higher levels contextualize the lower ones. So, for example, if I know that I'm in the kitchen, then the kinds of things, specific things I expect to happen are different than if I'm in the backyard, for example. And so, you might have predictions about which room you're in then higher up, and then you have predictions about what's happening in the room at a level below that. And this is also true of, if you think you're looking, let's say, at an object, if I think I'm looking at a glass, then I know which are the features I should be looking at, where kind of I should look around the object to make sure that it is a glass. And so there's sort of glass, and then like the features of the glass below that.
Yeah.
The same, this is sort of talking about more of the top-down predictive part, but then if our predictions are wrong, then sometimes we're also going to need to update our higher level understanding. And so if you get enough evidence that you're in the backyard when you think you're in the kitchen, eventually you're going to change your mind about what room you're in.
Right.
Yeah, which is obviously a slightly ridiculous example, but maybe and in certain circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you wake up and you wonder, if you're out camping, you think you're in your bedroom, and so you realize you're not.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. Specifically after waking up in particular, yeah, it can definitely happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can see how that might, like, an example might be that I've met somebody once, and they, for whatever reason, they were short with me or something, and then I assume they're an unkind person, something like that. And then I meet them again and again, next 5 times. They're very, very kind. They're very attentive and have a lot of time. And then you assume that they are a kind person. And yeah, this, I guess, starts to point to how these kind of higher levels can be problematic.
Yeah, if you're not updating enough with actual evidence from the world, because in a sense, and more in a subconscious sense, you think you've already got it figured out, then in a way, your kind of model of the world ends up getting kind of increasingly outdated, in a sense. It's not really kept up to date. So, we actually find this happens a lot, I think, in relationships where, there's some problem and one person's like, I really need you to change this. And then the other person actually starts changing it. But the person, and they're like, I'm doing the thing, I'm changing it. But actually the other person doesn't really see it. It's because they're still kind of predicting based on their old model of the other person. And it's quite hard to change that sometimes when it's like really established, those patterns and those habits, and those kind of predictions about how someone else is or how something is. When they're really strong, it becomes very difficult actually to update them. And I think it is particularly that kind of thing that, and we'll get into this more, but that actually meditation helps to work against. It helps to kind of counteract this like very ingrained habitual way of understanding things without looking so much at the evidence.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's empowering, really, from that perspective, particularly to see science validate it in this way. But that we essentially have control of our own model, and there are these tools out there where we can update and, decondition or recondition these potentially overly abstract or inaccurate views of the world or how people are or how we are within it.
Yeah, no, it really is, and it's I think it's quite empowering to discover that we can update our understanding of the world through various kind of techniques and procedures and whatnot in ways that if we don't believe that's possible, then we can feel a lot more restricted. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. Even within, I mean, really, all of this is within ourselves anyway, but we can recognize if we have exercised that day or not, or practiced that day or not, or eaten well that day or the day before or not. And we can come to the same situation with such a different attitude that, it just helps increase the ability, or I guess the wisdom to help update our models.
We can go back to what we were talking about before to kind of talk about that of like, if you change the higher level context in which you're doing something, then it has all of these kind of lower level downstream effects of how we perceive things as a consequence. And so it's powerful to recognize that changing our context in all these kind of subtle ways, and as you say, it could just be going to the gym, actually it affects kind of all of these more subtle kind of details of life as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's empowering to keep that in mind, I think.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I like what you said, that the higher levels contextualize the lower levels. I think that's, like, I imagine it like a painting almost that has varying levels of transparency as you move through the stack. Thank you so much for listening so far. I just wanted to take a quick moment to jump in and give you an update from the FitMind team. So we recently launched an incredible new course, which is free in the app, which is the preferred approach, and also on YouTube. It's called 30 Days of Meditation, Science, and Bliss. And this has combined what we feel is the most effective contemplative practices with what we feel is the most important, the science. Honestly, I can't believe the course is free. It's genuinely incredible and has changed my life. Also, FitMind recently transitioned to an NGO. So if there is any way that you can help us at all, we now survive entirely off donations. And even if you can't afford to help out financially, if you could just give us a like or share this podcast, or the course with anyone that it might help. Our goal here is simply just to help as many people as we can. We thank you so much. Now, back to the episode. So you define precision as confidence. How does the brain decide how much confidence to give, like a stressful thought versus anything like something neutral or otherly, within a situation?
The idea of precision, maybe I'll just back up a little bit. The idea of precision is basically because frameworks like active inference, predictive processing, they're probabilistic frameworks that work on this idea of probability distributions from statistics, particularly Bayesian statistics. And so the idea is that you have some hypothesis, let's say, about what you're perceiving at a given moment. And what your hypothesis is, you might, be 60% confident you're looking at a dog, but then you also might be 20% confident you're looking at a cat and 20% confident you're looking at a possum. And so the precision is basically like, if you increase the precision, you increase the confidence And in this case, it would be the confidence you're looking at a dog. So increasing the precision would be now the probability you're looking at a dog is maybe like 90, and that you're looking at a cat is 10, and the possum is 10. And so that's kind of the way it works. It's whatever your best guess is at that moment about the most probable thing you're perceiving. It's just increasing precision strengthens the probability that is the thing. It increases your confidence, and decreasing your precision decreases your certainty about what you're perceiving in this way.
Well, how would it decide to give more precision to like a stressful thought?
Basically, you can think of the way at kind of the highest levels of this kind of hierarchy, then you're making kind of predictions that you can't actually change, that you are safe, that you have all of your needs met, you're not thirsty, you're not hungry, you're not in pain, these kinds of things. And so if you're having, let's say, you said a stressful thought, is that right?
Yeah, like a stressful thought versus maybe like a physical sensation might make it easier to describe.
Yeah, so something stressful is, I guess we kind of have to get into why is it considered stressful. So if usually something's stressful because it's taken as a threat to you.
Yes.
And so something that's a threat to you, you're predicting that, and this is kind of the slightly curious way that active inference works, but you're predicting that you're safe, but there's this continuous evidence kind of coming in through your senses that there's a threat. And so you can't update your model of the world to accept being unsafe in some sense. So what you actually need to do, if you can't update that model of the world, is you would then need to act on the world in some way to actually make it feel safer, to be more in line with your prediction that it is safe. I don't know whether that fully answers what you're saying.
Yeah, it does. And we'll probably start to get into letting go, which I think might answer the question better. But why would you... Yeah, actually, I think we'll come back to it, because we'll probably letting go or describe, I think, what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and there's I'll add there's more to say and nuance and kind of caveat in what I just said as well. But that's typically how in predictive processing we think about threats and stress. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. So most people think of letting go as a vague emotional release, and you describe it as a endogenous decrease in precision. So first of all, how would you define letting go? And what does that look like in terms of the math in the brain?
It's a good question. It's a big question. Let's see. So yeah, letting go, I think, is actually a kind of central process behind or underlying meditation and also meditative development and progress over time. And yeah, so to give kind of an example of when someone lets go, then there's a kind of releasing of a kind of contraction or tensing in the mind, and usually there's a kind of increased sense of not knowing that also comes with this. and there's a sense of kind of an opening up. Things become a bit less conceptual. You feel like you're a little bit more in the here and now, in the present moment. You feel more equanimous. So you feel kind of less reactive to stimuli. And usually you also feel better. And so this is when, if you successfully let go, then these are the kinds of things you will notice as a consequence. And you'll also notice that kind of things are a little bit less reified or like labely also. So, you know, going to this coffee cup, I might normally just kind of quickly be like, coffee, boom. And so as I let go, and do it now, and what you find is this kind of brings more of the kind of features, kind of the reflections on the glass, the kind of coloring of the coffee in the glass, the kind of lines of it, and the kind of differences in contrast and these kinds of things. All of these sort of lower level features that you typically, under normal circumstances, just group as glass of coffee, start coming more actually into perception. And so when I talk about letting go, I'm talking about an experience with this phenomenology, basically, like with these experiential qualities. And so, yes, part of it is, this sense of feeling better, and this kind of, there's a kind of sense of relief there. But there's a whole kind of basket of associated changes in our experience that happen when one successfully manages to let go.
And from that perspective, you're letting go of the sort of higher level models, and you're getting closer to the low level sensory input. Is that correct?
Yeah. In a sense, because, and this is kind of the hierarchical organization in the brain. Yeah, you have sensory input, and then you have kind of this very kind of basic lower level input that's not terribly informative on its own. So, for example, in the visual system, you have something like line detection and line orientation detection. And then, like, much higher up, then you start to have like recognition of objects in some sense. And then you kind of have, even higher still, you kind of have this amodal, or you call it viewpoint invariant objects, where the object is not actually the visual thing per se, or the sound of the object per se, but it's a kind of mental thing that is informed by these different senses.
Yeah.
And basically the idea is, when you inject a kind of uncertainty or a not knowing, and my work is kind of showing how we can think of this in terms of active inference and precision. When you inject this kind of not knowing, then it kind of forces perceptual processing to kind of lower levels of this hierarchical model, this generative model in the brain.
So that's the letting go, the not knowing, and from that, the brain will then move into the lower levels and put increasing attention and focus on sensory input, or getting closer as we move down the stack.
Yes, although the not knowing actually is a consequence of perception being lower. So if you don't, in a sense, if you don't have any more of the certainty, then you're looking at a glass, then what you're looking at is only the evidence that would normally point to the fact you're looking at a glass, if that makes sense. So you sort of abandon the level where you're perceiving things like glasses, and you're sitting more in the perception where there's the not knowing of objects in a sense, but you still have the perception of, like lines and texture and some kind of form and maybe some differences in contrast and these kinds of things.
Yeah.
So it's like the not knowing is actually a consequence of perceiving lower in the way, at least I've been thinking about it.
Yeah, and from that sense, if it's a relief in itself that we don't know, I guess in some ways gives back a bit of beauty and a bit more of a childlike approach to life. And things become fresher and newer and exciting again. And there's less assumptions.
Yeah, exactly. And in a real sense, we actually are kind of taking in more from the world in those moments as well.
Yeah.
We're kind of drinking in the world a bit more.
And you talk about this downward cascade, which we've briefly touched upon, and we've spoken about Shamil Chandaria. He talked about the reason for this was just that the sensory input is just computationally explosive to create basically a whole world, at least my understanding, the whole world model from the amount of data that comes in. And that is why the generative model is useful. And I think that's the same as is used or similar to what is used in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Is that your understanding too, that it's just, it's simply an efficiency, it's kind of an efficiency approach from the brain?
Yeah, like I guess there's different things we could potentially talk about being computationally intractable, or that the brain needs to find efficient ways of doing. But kind of I think that, and I'm not sure if this is the one Shamil was referencing or not, but like basically we don't want a lot of chaotic kind of low level patterns and like little shimmering impressions if we need to effectively be acting on the world at that moment in a way that keeps us alive. What we need is very clear, relevant, useful features of the world to sort of come forth to us that we can act on. So we need a sense of, oh yeah, that's a person. And that person, is running at me with a knife. Like we need, that is food. And I know what food represents for me. And I want to go towards that. And so like these kinds of things, we need like a massively simplified world where there's only kind of the things that we can kind of do something with and act upon in a way that's useful for us. And so even what kind of gets qualified in a certain sense by the mind as an object are the things that are useful for us. And I think we see this, and you can kind of flip it around sometimes, but for example, normally when we're looking around in space, the things that are solid are the things that we're focusing on as objects, and what we're not actually focusing on is the space between objects. But you can kind of do a move where suddenly you start making the objects out of the spaces between the things that are solid. It's just normally that's not a useful thing to do in most contexts. So that's not what the brain is going to tend to do. And so all of this is sort of like the purpose of, as you move up the hierarchy, of extracting only these sort of simplified, useful features of the world in which we can act upon. It's kind of like a survival necessity in the end.
Yeah.
When we need to act. But the thing is, we don't always need to be in this kind of like acting, doing upon the world kind of mode. And I think that's where we'll go with this.
Yeah. Can you talk a bit more about the move that you discussed, actually? So you're saying to become aware of the space around objects. Is that,
for example?
Yeah.
And that's an experience. Some people who have done a bunch of meditation may have already noticed that sometimes it just happens that naturally after meditation or on retreat or something, those kinds of things can be more salient. That the space between objects is for some reason now, what I'm noticing more rather than actually the objects themselves.
Yes. Yeah. Like a de-weighting of the objects, I guess, like less mental tension or focus. That's a very triggered word in these circles, actually. But at least in my mind, it feels like less of a laser focus on, say, you, and more of a peripheral focus where you emerge within it.
Right. Yes, because in some sense, the sense of me is related to the things that I deeply know help me survive, or that might stop me from surviving.
Yeah.
And so when you move into a mode that's just more observing, and it has kind of less, in a sense, relevance for you as an organism, then also kind of the sense of self fades somewhat or attenuates when that happens.
And you've found a way to model like mental tension mathematically. So how does it look within the model when we're, say, like stuck or agitated or something like that?
We'll start before when I was kind of talking about the phenomenology or the experiential qualities of letting go, how I mentioned this sort of contracting, and this can also be experienced as a kind of like pressure or mental tension kind of in the mind. That's the opposite of things feeling open and expansive. And usually this sort of tensing or contracting is unpleasant. And it's not also exactly the same thing, even though it's how would I say it? Kind of metaphorically similar. It's not the same thing as muscular tension. So, for example, and I think I took this example from Shamil, actually, but it's like if you tighten your fist really hard and then you try to do as much letting go and opening up as possible in this area while your fist is still clenched. And so there is something that releases, but it's not actually the muscles that are holding your fist together. And so in this way, we can kind of distinguish the kind of like physical, although there does appear to be some sort of like causal influences between those two. So if you relax your body physically a lot, then you will also find that you're generally with less contracting mentally as well.
Yeah.
So they're not the same, but they are related and influence each other.
Yeah. So you're saying when you hold your fist together, but mentally you
so let go as much as possible.
Right.
While still maintaining your fist clenched.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, I can see that being particularly useful.
Yeah, it's a cool little thing.
So you created a computer simulation involving like facial recognition. Why choose face classification, and what happened to your computer agent when it was forced to let go?
Right. Yeah, so basically this kind of computational modeling work I did, the goal, is to show kind of computationally how the letting go process may work. And hook this into what we understand of the hierarchy in the brain and this So to kind of show this, the model has multiple levels, kind of like we've been talking about. And I chose to focus on the effects of letting go in the visual modality, basically. I did this mostly because I think it's actually easier for people to understand with the visual modality than if we're talking kind of about somatic sensations, let's say in the body. It didn't have to be that way, but it's letting go affects all sensory modalities. So in a sense, it doesn't actually matter which one. And while some traditions don't have a lot of open-eyed meditation, there are lots of traditions, Zen, just to give one example, that do. And so both formal meditation with your eyes open isn't unheard of at all, and is actually quite common in a number of traditions. And then also, when you think about in meditation, there becomes a point when one tries to like move their practice off the cushion into more informal practice in daily life. And this also involves letting go, often with your eyes open, while we're having this conversation right now, or whatever it is. And so, yeah, those are kind of the reasons I chose to kind of do this model referencing the visual system. But I could have done the auditory system. I could have done, one that was more about somatic representation. I just thought that this, in a certain sense, is easier to follow. And so then the kind of setup is that, again, sort of mirroring what we understand about the visual system, is you have, at the lower level, you have kind of individual facial features. So you'd have, the left eye, the right eye, and the mouth. And then you'd have a higher level, which let's call it face type, and where a combination of features in certain places will inform this agent, sort of this synthetic meditator, in this case, that they're looking at a face, and if it's a happy face or a sad face. But to get this higher level understanding, they need to move their gaze around to the different features at the lower level, which is actually how the visual system works. We're usually not aware of the movement of our eyes, but our eyes are continuously and actively moving to different areas to get the evidence for the kinds of objects we're looking at. And so, how then it works is this agent, this synthetic agent, will look around to the different regions of the face, and then it'll do this kind of lower level evidence accumulation on which facial feature it's looking at, and this will help inform at the higher level whether it's looking at the happy face or the sad face. And when it's sufficiently confident about which face type it's looking at, then it's going to select, yes, I'm looking at the happy face, or yes, I'm looking at the sad face. And it's incentivized the way it's set up in the model to get this correct. And so it's not going to make a guess before it has some degree of certainty. So that's sort of the general task setup. And then with this task setup, now it's like, okay, so what happens when we equip an agent doing this task with the ability to let go or not? That's sort of just the general kind of framing there. I don't know if
that definitely helped.
I missed.
And from that, basically, when the model felt bad, it would to feel better, it would let go. Is that correct?
Yes. So first, whether it's perceiving a happy face or a sad face is not related to how it itself is feeling. So that's first kind of detail to keep in mind. But yes, so remember when we talked about letting go, how when you do so, there's sort of a movement into like a sense of relief and more pleasant experience. Now, there's good computational reasons for this, I think, which are that when you have more abstract processing, your model of the world is more complex. So doing this higher level inference on these complex objects takes more, it's more computationally costly. And so it actually takes more effort. And so you'll find this fits in nicely when you go into simpler kind of ways of perception. They also take less effort, and so they feel better. And so basically the way in the model it works is when the agent spends too much time engaging in only this kind of higher level effortful processing, then it starts to feel progressively worse.
Okay.
And so when it feels sufficiently bad, it's like, okay, well, now it's time to meditate, time to let go, basically.
Okay.
And then when it does that, this is what I have modeled as this this decrease in precision. So initially it is very certain about the kind of face type it's looking at, but when it lets go, it decreases precision. So its confidence in whether it's looking at the happy face or the sad face decreases. And then because it's decreased, that just due to the kind of way the active inference framework is set up, it's sort of required to go down and try to get more certainty by doing inference or sampling at these lower levels, at the level of the individual features. And so its lack of confidence sort of drives it to doing this lower level perception again.
That's the kind of downward shift.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. And if for any of the listeners that might be having a stressful day, an anxious day, how would they themselves do this move, this downward shift?
It's a good question. And that is the sort of one of kind of the key questions of meditative practice, I think. And that's kind of, and this is only my understanding here, but I think what a lot of different meditation techniques are ultimately trying to achieve is letting go. It's just there's a variety of different ways in which you can actually bring it about. And you don't necessarily know which one is going to work for which person at which moment. And so, what you might do to get this kind of release of this contraction and this tension and letting go, it might be trying to equanimously perceive the changing nature of phenomena as they happen moment by moment in experience, which is sort of in Buddhism you talk about as the first characteristic of impermanence. Or it might be that you look at a different one, or you just try to very deeply accept everything as it is. And that this kind of deep acceptance kind of will bring about letting go. And it might be that if you just try to stop efforting, that once your mind kind of knows how to do that, you might just be able to directly stop efforting, and this might cause you to let go. And so you can think of kind of letting go as kind of a key kind of mechanism or process underlying these different techniques, basically. And I think that's still obviously an area where we need to do a lot of research and investigation, but I think it's quite a crucial one.
For anyone that hasn't maybe done something longer like a retreat, what would be what would be the difference between like just a daily practice versus maybe perhaps the ability to let go post retreat? Or what is it that happens then? Are you just becoming more skilled, or is there some other mechanics at play?
There's probably like any kind of answer to that is a very long and big answer, I think. So I'll just have to kind of pick and choose little bits.
Yeah.
It is an excellent question, though. I mean, in some kind of way, I think people, on average, and obviously experience isn't linear in this way over a retreat.
Yeah.
There's lots of ups and downs, and there can be difficult territory. But quite often people find it easier to let go after a retreat than they did before. So, for the retreat, they might have sat down and started trying to drop what was happening for them. And this was a very slow process and didn't work very well. And those thoughts of what happened yesterday were kind of difficult to get them to quieten down. But they might find that by the end of a retreat, they can actually just very kind of quickly let go of everything that's happening and enter a state that's reasonably deep, reasonably quickly. And then sometime this kind of thing ends up being kind of like locked in after that, as they retain this ability, and sometimes it fades. And as a whole kind of other question on that and what the difference there is and why, but yeah,
absolutely. That's a whole podcast in itself.
Totally. A future podcast.
You talk about how meditation is opening the sensory gates, and I read your reference to Jud Brewer's work on addiction, in particular, if you're smoking a cigarette and you attend to the taste or the feel of the cigarette. What's happening there? How are we updating our old beliefs?
Yeah, so you can think of it similarly. So the basic kind of idea here, it's a sort of like mindfulness approach to, I should say, smoking cessation, is that when you feel the urge to smoke, then what you try to do is you just try and actually pay attention to what it feels like to have that urge to smoke. So what is that craving for a cigarette? Like, what does that actually feel like? And try to get clearer in your experience on what that feels like. And so it turns out that when you try and do this, that is actually what helps make that craving go away. And how you might think about this in relation to what we're talking about is it's a little bit similar to say, if instead with the model we've talked about, we said to the agent, well, just see if you can just focus on these lower level features rather than actually what kind of face you're looking at. See if you can just focus on, what are the different parts of the face. Just look at the different parts and, or look at the sort of texture. This is kind of more generally, but look at the texture of the skin. Look at like how the light reflects. And so when you do this, you move the brain into more sort of information gathering, and you take it away from acting on the world, because acting is very much in the end a kind of like higher level phenomena. It's something that happens to make happen what we desire and want. And so when we lean more into finding out more information in a very experiential, embodied way, rather than trying to act in a way that changes our experience, that we actually don't feel the grip of needing to change our experience that much either.
Yeah. And this would have huge implications for people with PTSD, anxiety, and so forth. How would they use these models to help update these kind of outdated, unhelpful, like bodily sensations and
Right. So first, I don't want to. We're in a podcast. I don't want to prescribe that anyone doing anything who, in those circumstances without consulting a professional individually. And I think in part that's the case. So one thing that often happens is if people have a lot of traumatic experience, then this actually can often lead to them having a lot of trouble letting go because they actually don't want to experience again the kinds of things that were so brutally hard for them at some point in the past. And in general, this is just finding, like, suddenly exposing oneself to these things again and not being kind of prepared for it is not necessarily a good idea. And so I think that actually perhaps even some people that run into problems with letting go in meditation, might be served well by leaning into things like therapy and other ways of exploring and slowly and gradually in a kind of controlled way becoming more in touch with the kind of more direct experience. And you don't necessarily want to do it all at once, and it can be quite rough if you do. So yeah, I guess that's sort of what I'd say there. But I guess also having said that, it's like there's a high price to being cut off from our more direct experience. And so it's not, and it tends to obscure things like a sense of meaning, a sense of connection, a sense of being there really in that moment. And so at the same time, it's not like it is desirable to find the way to come more into contact with this lower level sensory experience, and to learn how to let go. It's just, if you've had something very difficult happen in your past, then you need to exercise a lot of care, and you might need some skilled assistance with that.
So you mentioned two different routes to deconstruction of the mind, the Jhana route and the insight route. So computationally speaking, what's the difference between these two paths? And probably actually we should, we talked briefly on jhanas, but define the insight route as well.
They're kind of two, I guess, modes through which one can let go into ultimately, with enough meditation practice, into a kind of a cessation of consciousness, which is sometimes called a fruition. And so the kind of one that's talked about in the suttas is going through the jhanas, and sometimes this process is called unbinding. And you kind of you focus on some aspect of experience at a certain point in your practice, and then if you're focusing on the right thing, then at some point there's this kind of fascinating phenomena where there's a kind of like feedback loop, like a self-propagating feedback loop that occurs, and then actually those sensations you were focusing on, you kind of start to expand until your experience is sort of like you become absorbed in those sensations. And then once you've established this in the first jhana, then you can do this again with a kind of subtler, more pleasant sensation, and you can move into the second jhana, and so on. And each time you do this, there is kind of a letting go, and things become more pleasant. But it's experientially in this quite like uniform way, where experience is kind of painted all with the I don't know how to say it, like the same sensational film, or that it's not a good way of saying it, but something like that. It's like and so the insight, the insight route, there's a sort of other way of doing this, and this is more from kind of more modern traditions like the Mahasi Sayadaw tradition and Burmese Buddhism. In particular, they emphasize this more, and here they kind of say, well, you don't actually need to enter into jhanas to do this. You can go just through experience being very flexy and changing. It doesn't need to have this kind of all-encompassing absorption quality. But that what you will still notice as you move towards cessation is that there is release, there is letting go. And that there's, and that furthermore, and this is, I think Sayadaw Pandita talked about this initially, is there is a kind of correlation of some of the qualities in this more like flexy variable kind of insight process of letting go to cessation. There is some kind of resemblance at the same time. There's something in common that those have with the jhana route. So there's a kind of correspondence there.
Okay.
And so it's important that when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about it quite linearly, and this can be the case when someone has already gone through this process before and has become accomplished at it. I'm not saying that this is, the first time you go through the insight stages, that it's all just going to be getting better and better and better and better, then you're in cessation. There's lots of evidence that's not the case, that it's quite non-linear, that there's a bunch of difficult territory that you move through at a certain point, and it's maybe necessary to some extent, but how difficult it is, there's a lot of questions around this. So, but in any case, when one has already managed to do this sort of deconstructive process to cessation, and then one can enact it in a given meditation session, that's kind of the context in which I'm talking about it here, just to be clear.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we got to spend a lot of time talking about ins and outs.
Yeah, definitely. And for anyone that wants to dive into the jhana route or jhanas a little bit further, they can check out the conversation with Shamil Chandai.
Nice.
So at the end of the hierarchy, there's this cessation, the blinking out of experience, which some people would compare to like a micro deep sleep. There is a break or a space in your awareness. Would you say this is a system crash, a system reboot, an upgrade? Why would we want to blink out?
Yeah, I mean, a cessation itself has no experience, so it in and of itself doesn't necessarily have any value. But it's sort of like what we're interested in is how one ends up there and what one goes through in getting there and how experience changes in getting there, and then how things happen when one, like right afterwards, when experience comes back online. And I think those are really interesting questions and tell us something really meaningful about the mind that I think contemplative science is only kind of now, maybe a little bit in the last few years, actually starting to tackle. And it because there is something of, if meditators can effectively slowly turn down the knob on consciousness until it turning off, and then it kind of comes back, then what does this tell us about how the mind constructs reality? And I think there's something, really useful there. And so, when after a cessation, there's often reported as sort of like rebooting process where you see kind of, in a sense, these like perceptions start from this sort of like lower level perception of sensations, but things are quite ineffable. They're not intelligible in a conceptual way exactly. And then you slowly, more and more of that conceptual richness kind of comes back online. Although quite often there's also this sort of like effect of you do stay kind of more in the present moment for some period of time, even after things are mostly back online afterwards than you were beforehand. And so there's a lot of kind of insight to be found in the construction of reality through observing this kind of rebooting process. And the kind of Buddhist argument would be that when you have this first happen and you have a kind of path moment, then after that, your degree of suffering kind of at baseline has decreased. If you have the right kind of cessation, because there's some talks about other things that are not that, that might look similar superficially. And so one might not care if one has a cessation per se, but you might care about having baseline reduced suffering after having had one for the first time.
Right. So essentially another way of saying it would be that your models are potentially going to have significant updates or changes.
Before a cessation even happens, as one's learning how to meditate more, you start off with, experiencing your own body and the feeling of your own body as something that doesn't change very much. It seems quite steady and stable over time. How you visually perceive things seems that way at all. If you're not changing the stimuli you're looking at, you have a sense that nothing's really changing. And as you progress in practice, you start to notice there's more kind of flux and movement when you're in certain states, and you start to see even feel your own body in sort of different ways where things don't feel as sort of these large, gross sensations, and you start having these more like subtle kind of sensations that seem to be kind of moving and happening and changing more often. And so all of this process, I think, is kind of you are learning or perhaps rediscovering something about reality in this process, where you're seeing, oh yeah, things are not as fixed, as non-changing as I thought they were. And the more you see this at these sort of lower levels, then because these lower levels, again, they provide evidence for the higher levels, then this causes your kind of understanding of the world to update. And so over time, you are accumulating more and more evidence that the world is, or reality is, in a slightly different way than you thought it was. And this kind of point I make in the master's thesis, Opening the Sensory Gates, but it's like, at some point, what it seems like is that there's this kind of our existing model of reality that kind of things are more permanent and things are unchanging and there's less flux. There's that, and we develop this new one where in meditation, we're noticing that things are different. And eventually this new model the evidence for it becomes so strong that what I propose is that what might be happening in things like awakening is actually we're kind of pruning the old model because it's no longer as good as explaining reality as the new one. And so when that happens, your sort of whole perceptual system kind of, even not meditating, kind of shifts to perceiving things in this more fluxy, kind of moving, impermanent way.
So you're kind of turning down the volume of me and turning up the volume of reality, to put it in a metaphor.
The first part's maybe not even a metaphor, because we know, like, the sort of from contemplative science, we know that long-term meditators actually seem to have less higher level activation, even at rest, even not meditating. They have less higher level activation. And that higher level activation is typically associated with kind of self-related processing. And so that sort of seems to provide evidence basically for what you're saying.
That's in relation to the default mode network.
Yeah, exactly. Activity being lower down means that we are kind of taking in more information from the world, and we're sort of in a way more responsive to it. We have a bit of a closer, a better fit with what's actually happening. And so there's a certain kind of like agility that we can kind of see there, where just start updating when things change. We're more sensitive to those changes. And we also kind of know that things are not going to exactly stay as they were.
Yeah. And there's an okayness with that.
Yeah, which again is due to this decreased higher level stuff.
In the studies with reduced default mode network activity, does it look, because I remember in the psychedelic studies what they found, there was like increased perceptual experience, but decrease in the default mode network and decreasing brain activity. And then different regions, there was increased connectivity between regions that
as well
usually communicate. Is that the same? Because I find that it's always really interesting. Yeah, it almost looks like the brain becomes more like a natural system. Like there's less centralization. Like I'm kind of corresponding it with blockchain or something, but
yeah, I mean, I think there is less, I guess you could say, constraining of the system from the top. And so that, yeah, you could say something like that. I'm not sure exactly what the psychedelic studies are, but yeah, you do see also in meditation increased connectivity between a bunch of areas. The story is a little bit more complicated there because you also have some increased or decreased connectivity in certain places too. And so like we maybe don't have like the full, I think we need to do more work to figure out what's happening there, but yeah, there may be a story of also there are kind of new ways that we can come to identify patterns that we weren't previously able to. Once we have a kind of more flexible system that isn't always stuck in this sort of more top-down way of processing the world and perceiving it.
You hear often we talk about equanimity and stillness. And I think for anyone that hasn't experienced equanimity is not a very exciting word. At least it wasn't for me.
No, doesn't really mean it. It didn't mean anything to me before.
It sounds somewhat neutral, and I can only really relate because equanimity, I guess, can be also described as peace. And there's been varying like levels of experiences, one of which where I just felt like a very large bomb could go off next to me and I would be unmoved by that. And from that perspective, the need for something else was gone, or at least it was imperceptible to me. Like how close are we? How would you reframe equanimity first, actually? And how close are we to getting like some sort of mathematical algorithm or score where we can measure equanimity?
The term is tricky because people use it in different ways. Some people talk about equanimity as kind of a state one attains, and there's kind of, though, I think in this sort of like not reactive way that I like to think about it, and I think there's a lot to this, is that if you think of it like we're perceiving something, right? And what we're perceiving, that thing is still there. It's not changing. However, our actual perception of what's there is changing. And so in this sense, I don't actually think that equanimity is per se perceiving things the way they really are. I think equanimity is perceiving things in a different way. And it's a different way that can often feel better. And it can inform us of something in a way that maybe perceiving with less equanimity can't inform us of that same thing. But it's really perceiving with equanimity, I think, is a kind of perceiving differently. And I think it's a perceiving differently that's associated with generally like lower level perception, as kind of we've been talking about. And so I think there's a way of computationally talking about equanimity where it has to do with how much are we perceiving in these kind of lower level ways? How much are we perceiving in these sort of higher level, have to do something about the situation kind of ways? And so I think like at some point, probably we can do something like, the neuro correlates of what more or less equanimous experience are. Obviously we're a ways from getting there, but I think at least if you think of equanimity in this way, that it's really like changing based on where in the hierarchy we're perceiving, then I think we have kind of tractable directions we can move in to try and precisely understand it. I don't think it needs to be this sort of like kind of mysterious kind of notion per se.
What's next for your research?
I've got a couple things I'm working on that are I'm working on as I'm trying to finish the PhD. So I'll have one that's kind of looking at developing a better computational understanding of effective valence, and sort of using some of these understandings from looking at computational mechanisms of meditation to try and understand what's happening with valence more broadly in a computational way. And also with some collaborators, hopefully in not too long, we're going to have a paper out on the self and a kind of active inference, sort of using active inference as a framework mostly to talk about sort of different things people mean when they refer to the self. Because I think there's a lot of confusion there, and you get people saying, well, you couldn't do this without a self. You'd be useless. And of course, if you take sort of the meditative project, at least of Buddhism, you take it seriously that there is some kind of self. There is something that can potentially disappear fully, and you can still remain a functional human being in the world. So we're going to look at sort of trying to see if we can, in a very sort of clear way, sort of pull apart two separate notions of the self there. And yeah, I guess those are the main things for now. Once my head moves out of the PhD to elsewhere, there'll be more stuff. I mean, in general, like, I'm interested in, ultimately I want a full scientific understanding of awakening. That is what I'm interested in. And so you can't do that in a single project, but I intend to be picking at that from different angles for the foreseeable future. So
Right.
yeah.
Right. Yeah, well, that's incredible, and it's very exciting. And we'd love to have you back on at some point. It's been great to chat.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. This has been really fun.
Thank you so much for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please, if you could give us a like, a subscribe, and hit the notification bell, that would really help us out. Or just share this episode with a friend, share the course with a friend. Anything would go such a long way. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon.